And she really struggled with it. And yet she was the number one physical performer for her drill sergeant leader class. And she quite honestly felt like the Army had been less than accurate in identifying the 3-event APFT as the single measure, for readiness to do, high physical command.
Welcome back, Marksman Tribe. You're listening to Dr. Whitfield East, our guest today. He's an Army research physiologist responsible for developing the new Army Combat Fitness Test. It was a fantastic interview, and we got a lot of information. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome to Everyday Marksman Radio, the podcast where we talk about tactical skills for an adventurous life. I'm your host, Matt Robertson. This is episode number 6. If you want to look at today's show notes, go to everydaymarksman.co/6, the number 6, everydaymarksman.co/6. I was looking forward to this one because as a former member of the Air Force myself, I always kind of wondered where our fitness test came from. And I got a lot of those answers here. So some of you guys for listening, I know I have some active duty folks on board. You're going to want to listen to this one, all right? Now, the other big takeaway from this, besides just how we got to the 3-event test, is the entire history of how did we evolve as a military fitness culture from the 1800s to today? And more importantly, how did we finally come up with a new combat-oriented test for the Army that actually helps predict performance in the field, which I think is an extremely interesting and important thing to talk about. But more importantly for me, as no longer being in the military, and for a lot of you guys out there who aren't military yourselves, we're also going to talk about what kind of training program is most appropriate for you if you want to have a nice, healthy, well-balanced lifestyle that keeps you ready and prepared. By the way, if you are new to the podcast, I really would appreciate if you took a moment to go ahead and subscribe on your podcast player of choice, maybe leave me a review. And as always, if you're pressed for time, go ahead and jump to the last 15 minutes or so. We're going to get my key takeaways. I have a couple of quotes of his. I have my thoughts on the matters. It kind of helps sum things up or just remind you of the key points. All right. With that said, let's get right to it. Our guest today is a research physiologist for U.S. Army Center for Initial Military Training at U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, and is responsible for leading a review and analysis of physical fitness training efforts for the U.S. Army. He is native of North Carolina and earned a doctorate in kinesiology from University of Georgia. He's built a career out of studying fitness and sports science in Iowa and Tennessee, and from 2000 to 2013, he served as Director of Instruction in the Department of Physical Education at United States Military Academy. In 2013, he published a historical review and analysis of Army physical readiness training and assessment with the Combat Studies Institute. It remains one of the most comprehensive overviews of historical American military fitness training to date. From 2013 to 2016, Dr. E served as principal investigator for Army Baseline Soldier Physical Readiness Requirements Study. The product of this study was the Army Combat Fitness Test, which will replace the current 3-event Army Physical Fitness Test later this year. He currently serves as the head research physiologist for U.S. Army Center for Initial Military Training, or CIMT. And as a quick disclaimer, I also want to point out this conversation reflects his opinions and are not reflective of DoD, Army, or CIMT policy. Dr. East, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So it's a pleasure to have you here. So I kind of want to start off reading a quote from the document I mentioned earlier, the Historical Review and Analysis of Army Physical Readiness Training. So you open that with a quote from James Pilcher in 1892, when physical training ceased to be a national characteristic and the men of brawn were succeeded by creatures of luxury, the decadence of national prosperity followed. So I want to start with that and get your opinion of why you think that was a really good way to open the book.
So I think there's at least two reasons that was a good start point. Number one is it was written in the 1800s. So it basically identifies this systemic problem that we have begun to experience. And there are several other times throughout history where we see individuals talking about the national issue with fitness and the lack thereof. And so it was a good place to start from that perspective. Secondly, it is a problem that has plagued modern armies for the last 200 years. And this is not a new problem. It is, I think, perhaps continuing to move in a direction that's going to be problematic in the future.
So I noticed in that writing, you mentioned, I think going into World War I think there was some percentage of the population that was ineligible to fight because they weren't in good enough shape. And that got worse by World War II. And it seems like I hear articles today talking about like almost 75% of the population, young males in particular, aren't fit to fight.
So those numbers become a bit of a moving target. And what you'll hear most people talk about is single digit types of numbers, 5 out of 10, 4 out of 10. So going into World War I, we were at about a 5 out of 10, medically qualified, physically qualified to engage in military service. And the interesting thing about that was people have a perception of a more agrarian, a more industrial society, more physically fit. But there were a lot of bad things that happened to people who worked in those kind of high threat farm and industry types of jobs. People lost hands and fingers, and so that they weren't qualified to serve. So from World War I to World War II, it was about a 50% rate, about 5 out of 10. Depending on the numbers that you see today, that number is starting to creep down into the high twos. So 2.7, 2.8, 2.6 are medically and physically qualified to serve. And based on the number of service members that we recruit and train every year, that's incredibly problematic.
Right. I know from a strategic standpoint, that's if you don't have a solid base to work from. So, I mean, being a deterrence guy, I came from the nuclear world, and I know that's an issue. If you don't have the right presence to say you have effective deterrence, because look at our population, look at our capability, it's a warning sign to adversaries.
So it was clearly, it's interesting you mentioned nuclear deterrence, because clearly the genesis of this in our generation has been in the late 50s and 60s with Eisenhower and Kennedy, relative to physical fitness as a country and the development of the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sport, and the emphasis that those individuals placed on youth fitness as a precursor to national service, whether it be military or voluntary service or whatever your mode of service. So it was much, I think, a much more important concept and problem as we moved through the 50s and 60s, and it has obviously, in my mind, gone in the wrong direction for the last 25 to 50 years.
So why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a combination of a couple things. One is, and I'm a World War II baby, so I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Everybody played sport all the time. You either played sport in school. There was a lot of scholastic, interscholastic type of sport, intramural types of activities. There was physical education classes in schools. A lot of that has gone away, and sport has become rather elitist, and part of that pertains to this perception that we need to start tracking young people into sports at earlier and earlier ages so that they might someday be the master of that sport, in their teens and early 20s, which might garner either scholarships or monies in professional sports and those types of things. So there's a significantly fewer people are actually participating in physical activity today than there were, 50 years ago.
How, from your perspective, how has military fitness training evolved over time?
So I think the important thing to consider is the threat. What are the threats to soldiers? And to a certain degree, that more or less drove some of the training that we've seen for the last 1,000 years, for that matter. Initially, the threat was hand-to-hand combat types of threat. I mean, we had swords and spears and those types of things, and that's the way we fought. So most service members will tell you that hand-to-hand type of combat, soldier-on-soldier combat, is the most physically demanding type of combat. So we train soldiers to execute that type of warfare. As we moved into standoff weapons, individual weapons, personal weapons, crew-served weapons. As we moved in that direction, we were able to kill people from a long way away. So this physical type of requirement was not as great. And interestingly, going back to the nuclear threat in the 60s and 70s, there were individuals who posited that we were really never going to have another land war, that everything was going to be a nuclear standoff type of scenario, which obviously has proven to be incorrect. So if you go through, the Spanish-American War, Civil War, World War I, individual soldiers had a uniform and perhaps a helmet and a weapon, and that was pretty much it. So mobility and strength was not as big a factor. In 1916, 1917, when the French and the British developed the light tanks, basically mobility became a significant issue. We were no longer, entrenched in a particular location, and we saw individuals who had to move over short to long distances to keep up with mechanized vehicles so that they could fight. And that changed the quotient of how we trained a little bit. Then in the 20s and the 30s, interestingly to me, the development of drugs such as sulfa and penicillin was another factor that changed the way we trained, because up until that point, if you look at all the training manuals that came out of 1828 up to 1919, those training manuals talked about conducting exercise to develop physical vigor, health and vigor. So health and vigor were incredibly important at that time. And so doing things like, aerobic types of exercises or body weight types of exercises were appropriate based on what the outcome objectives were. As we started to move into World War II, we started putting more and more on soldiers to the point where today most modern soldiers, as they go into a fight, are carrying somewhere between 80 to 90 pounds. That changes everything. It changes mobility, it changes strength requirements, and that was part of the genesis for the baseline soldier physical readiness requirement study, in that soldiers have been telling us for years that we needed to be stronger, we needed to be able to generate and apply power at an entirely different level based upon the type of kinetic environment in the fight that they were conducting today, especially related to the loads that they were carrying.
Okay. So a couple things I want to come back before we kind of get to the current requirements, because I know that was a big topic. In the reading, you mentioned the emphasis on vigor, physical health and vigor. And I know you referenced something, the Turnvarians, and I guess that came from Herman Kohler, I think was the kind of the guy in the US. But what does that look like compared to like modern fitness? So
basically, starting back in the late 1600s, early 1700s, predominantly the epicenter was Sweden, to a certain degree France, Prussia. There were individuals who were a combination of theologians and physicians who recognized that there were not a significant number of medical treatments that they could apply to their followers, if you will, who to help heal them once they became sick. And so basically what they embarked upon was a set of exercises to develop or promote health and vigor. And we see that a lot as you look back through that 1700 to 1825 period, the need to be healthy and fit as a way of having a long and productive life. I find it incredibly interesting. It's kind of the CSI of the exercise military world, how this actually happened. So there's a young man by the name of Folkenkleist, who was actually born in Boston, whose father was born in Switzerland and was not interested in having his son educated in the colonies. So he boarded a ship, went back to Europe to have his son, Fokan Kleis, educated. And on the way, the father died. And so Kleis, they didn't have MasterCard and Visa back then, so he had a chest full of money. And so basically he said, do I want to pal around Europe with a chest full of money, or do I want to go to school? So the palling around Europe with a chest full of money seemed like a good idea. And so he moved out and basically was a quasi-vagabond, and he went from location to location. And along the way, he started picking up the idea of gymnastics, Swedish gymnastics, and ultimately Prussian gymnastics. What that was is primarily body weight, but there were certain apparatuses like poles and ropes and ladders, and individuals did exercises that promoted upper body strength, in particular posterior chain type of work. If you think about pull-ups and climbing and lower body core types of thing, doing pole climbs and rope climbs. There were also vaulting horses that were the precursors to modern gymnastics, the pommel horse. And so it was, I think, a low budget, industrial scale type of physical activity. And if you go back and look at the Turnverein photos, images that we have, you see these mass, large numbers of individuals on a field doing coordinated types of exercise, which was sort of the second part of this. There was a firm belief, if I'm sitting in a trench in France in 1917 and somebody says, get up and run at that machine gun, the expectation is that you're going to do that. So these types of mass athletic movement, extended rectangular formations where people were on a cadence and did things, was in part theoretically derived out of the idea of learning to take commands and adhere to commands and execute on command. And obviously a little bit different today. To wrap this story back around, Kleis actually ran out of money in Switzerland. He joined the Swiss Army. He had married along the way, and one day his men were out doing what men do out in the middle of the field. But anyway, so they're messing around. So he says, we're all going to do gymnastics. And interestingly, there was a British delegation there, and they saw him, and they actually hired him to come back to England and start military gymnastics in England, which is where he started it at Sandhurst, and ultimately wrote the first training manual in 1828, I believe. And then later on, he transferred that to a guy by the name of McLaren, who carried that on. And those individuals were influencing the Turners, who ultimately came to the United States and settled in the Midwest, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa, and were the forerunners to Herman Keeler, who eventually became the Master of the Sword at the United States Military Academy.
So what's interesting about that story is, you often hear comparisons that the Olympics are always kind of a representation of military skill and capability. And it makes sense when you talk about gymnastics now, hearing that story that, Olympic gymnastics has a lot of relationship to that style of training that happened for hundreds of years.
I think that's in fact true. And I spent a good bit of time at West Point that still has a gymnastics program. And I talked to the coach up there quite a bit. And if you look at gymnasts, they look very muscular, very fit, very lean, very athletic. And, basically the interesting thing to me was they do very little high intensity, low repetition types of lifting. A lot of what they do is body weight, but they do a lot of overload for body weight types of exercises like rope climbs or bar work. So it is a methodology, a training methodology. I would argue today that our strength requirements are perhaps as great as they've ever been. And obviously the translation to the ability to generate and apply power. So I think that it's important that we have the right individuals to train soldiers and the right facilities and equipment to train soldiers so that we can get them to the level of fitness that we need.
And I know there was a parallel effort between Herman Kahler and then I guess Joseph Raycroft later on, who kind of started doing a different kind of fitness.
So actually, truth is those two individuals were kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum. And if it hadn't been for Woodrow Wilson, it was just an interesting time period relative to where we were going with fitness. And Raycroft was interested in physical fitness, but what he believed is that the daily work of a soldier back then, and we have to remember how incredibly small the United States Army was until we started drafting into World War II. But the daily work of the soldier doing soldier stuff was very physically demanding. So he didn't really believe that they needed a lot more physical activity, but what they needed was, motor fitness, sport type skills. And so he's kind of the father of modern intramural mass athletics. And he introduced that to the Army for a variety of reasons. He actually started it when he was the head of the physical education department at Princeton, but he introduced that as a method of productively using soldier time, which might have gone awry if they weren't engaged, plus team development, leadership, and then that physical activity they got from playing soccer and basketball and football and softball and all those other types of mass athletics.
So I want to move forward a little bit because we started talking about the strength demand started growing. And I know there was a study, the ORO did it in early 1950s, Project All Clad, which I don't have a lot of information about other than the result of it was we need to develop better armor. And I think that was kind of the first trend towards more mechanized warfare where we have to add more weight onto each soldier. So is that kind of the progress of how things kept going?
So I have a personal philosophy about kind of where this is. Once we developed, combat medicine to the point where death rate due to infectious and communicable diseases and injuries, either combat related or not combat related, went from 65, 70, 75% down to 25 or 30%. We had a scenario where it became more important to develop alternate, military strategies and better ways of protecting soldiers. So we see the development of body armor. We see changes in the Army combat helmet, and we see those weights going up incrementally, which, as I said earlier, significantly reduces mobility and also increases the need for lower body and core strength to prevent these overuse injuries that naturally occur when I'm carrying around 70 or 80 or 90 pounds all day long. So we saw, coming out of Vietnam, going into Grenada, moving on from there, we saw a significant change in the fitness needs of soldiers. And if you haven't read much about the Grenada conflict, there's some incredibly interesting anecdotal reports of basically soldiers jumping in or landing in Grenada, moving a couple hundred meters and having to take everything off because they were carrying, 120, 140, 150 pound load. And in that heat and humidity, they simply weren't able to function.
As we because it seems like everybody recognized that the needs of combat were always a physically demanding experience with sprinting and lifting and carrying and load. But I always feel like, and coming from the Air Force myself, we had a very similar 3-event physical fitness test of running, sit-ups, and push-ups. How did both the services end up with that as a fitness test versus a more combat-oriented one to begin with?
So there's some interesting history in that 1975 to 1985 period. And I don't know that we will ever be able to quantify what were the drivers behind the change, but there were 3 or 4. So one of the most important was incorporating women into the United States Army. So that was one of the factors, which is really interesting because if you go back and look at the Women's Army Corps PT test, it was more physically demanding than the 3-event APFT. So that's an interesting conundrum. The second would be the proliferation of nuclear weapons and, to a certain degree, the mindset that we're just not going to fight land wars anymore. It's all going to be mutually assured deterrence, and we're going to be okay. So physical fitness isn't quite as important. I think you saw perhaps the Navy and the Air Force move out much more rapidly on a health-related kind of format. The third thing would be in society in that period of time, in the 1975 to 1985 time period, there was a pretty significant change away from the concept of, so in that period of time, there were two competing concepts, physical fitness and motor fitness. Physical fitness was generally described as the quantitative aspects of movement. It was strength, endurance, power, those types of things. Motor fitness was more agility, coordination, balance, flexibility, those types of things. And up until that time, most of the physical education in public schools and colleges talked about physical fitness and motor fitness. At that time, there was a shift away from motor fitness training and assessment to more physical fitness training and assessment. And in particular, by the mid-'80s, the concept of health-related fitness. So we talked about, cardio, muscular strength, muscular endurance, body composition. Those were to a certain degree, flexibility. Those were the foci, if you will, of the physical fitness types of training and assessment. So all of that kind of came together under the auspices of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Ken Cooper, who was a significant influencer, former Air Force captain, was helping to develop programs for the Air Force. And if anyone knows Dr. Cooper, he is a huge aerobic person. And basically the idea was we would, because of all of the reasons I mentioned, we're going to move away from assessments that are more equipment intensive and time intensive to something that's very simple. It's more of a health related fitness test, and it's something we can do anywhere in a very short period of time. So all of those things came together to bring us into the 3-event test. And the irony behind it is, if you go back and look at the history, FM 21-20, which was the Army's physical training doctrine, was updated and revised on about a 5-year turn every year from the early 1940s. And almost every revision of FM 21-20, there was a change in the PT test. I don't think there was ever an intent for this to go 38 years, 39 years, 40 years, and not have some revision. And there were a lot of efforts to do that over the years, at least 4 that I know of, and all of those have failed to date. And hopefully we've reached kind of irreversible momentum with the ACFT.
So something you had mentioned before with that the 3-event test, and I saw the same thing when I was in the Air Force, but it seems like the Army might have actually had 2 tests at one point, but because the test of record was the 3-event, that's the one everybody focused on to the detriment of the other. So
there's always been, if you go back to AR 350-1, there's always a caveat in that Army regulation that says commanders need to determine the readiness of their soldiers. They need to use the assessments that they think are appropriate to determine the efficacy of their physical training program and their soldiers' ability to meet their mission essential tasks. It really, there have been, a variety of ancillary types of assessments throughout the year, but most individuals focus primarily on the 3-event test for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is it became institutionalized as sort of a human resource tool in terms of promotion and professional military education schools and those types of things. So the focus on that became kind of universal.
Yeah, there's a saying that I'm sure you've heard before. I use it all the time, even outside the military now, but you are what you measure. And when you put that much emphasis on something, it kind of becomes the de facto
So
state.
if you wrap it into the assessment model, if you think about measures of performance, measures of effectiveness, and you're trying to evaluate individuals for whatever reason, if you look at the list of performance assessments that you evaluate, a lot of them are very subjective. Like, is this individual a good person? Are they a good leader? Do they take care of their soldiers? It becomes that the PT test became very powerful as perhaps the only truly objective standardized assessment that was universal across all soldiers in the Army. So it became very powerful in terms of standardization and objectivity. So it did grow disproportionate to its significance, especially as we found out in the study.
Okay, so that's actually going to get me to, I guess, in the late 1990s, I guess Dr. Edward Thomas found the old World War II fitness test and administered it to a bunch of soldiers in the late 90s. And they found it pretty difficult. Do you have any kind of insight? Is that kind of the end result of losing focus?
So I think so. I think so. One of the key principles of exercise is the concept of specificity, right? So if I focus on elements 1 and 2 and don't focus on 3, 4, and 5, if you come back and assess those other 3 elements, I'm probably not going to do all that well. The interesting thing is if you take units that have training programs or have migrated to training programs like Special Forces or Rangers, and you assess them across a broad spectrum of physical performance requirements, they do really well. And the reason is they train across that broad spectrum. But we had individuals who were focused in, and to a certain degree were told, you're good to go. If you can do some push-ups and sit-ups and run 2 miles in a decent time, you're fit to do everything we need a soldier to do. One of my most interesting stories was with a drill sergeant leader when we started the baseline study, and we set up a warrior task and battle drill simulation test, which everyone in the study had to do on top of the physical exercises. And we used it as the criterion measure for the study. And she really struggled with it. And yet she was the #1 physical performer for her drill sergeant leader class. And she quite honestly felt like the Army had been less than accurate in identifying the 3-event APFT as the single measure, for readiness to do, high physical demand tasks.
Hey guys, Matt here. I need to jump in just for a minute to let you know that the audio quality is about to change because at this point in the interview, we had internet drop out on his end and we had to switch from using voice over IP to going to over a conference phone. So that's it. Just wanted to give you that heads up. Let's get back to it. So let's talk about that baseline study then, because you've mentioned a couple of times, that was a big part of what got to the ACFT. What were you actually looking at in that baseline?
So we were given 3 tasks within the HQDA XORD. The number was 04113. And those were to determine the physical demands, the components of fitness that were required of high physical demand warrior task and battle drills, common soldier task. That was the first requirement. The second requirement was to determine how well the current 3-event APFT predicted a soldier's ability to execute those high physical demand tasks. And the third component was if the 3-event APFT was not predictive at the level we wanted, what other events were more predictive of a soldier's ability to execute high physical demand tasks.
So then when you looked at all those numbers and you arrived to what is now the ACFT, how did each component actually relate to a soldier's task in the field?
So the way we designed the study was just a classic criterion reference study. And the problem that we had was the very first thing we had to come up with was a criterion measure. So we actually developed the warrior task and battle drill simulation test, which was we started with all of the warrior task and battle drill common soldier tasks and distill them down to the 11 most physically demanding. Within those 11, there was a lot of overlap, like move as a member of a team, react to direct fire, react to indirect fire. There were a lot of movement components that were a part of 3 or 4 different warrior task and battle drills. So we basically brought that down to 5 ultimate tasks. And it was move under load to contact, build a hasty fighting position, move over, under, around, and through obstacles on unimproved terrain, react to direct contact, and extract and evacuate a casualty. So we created this simulation course that soldiers learn to execute. Think of a kind of an obstacle course, if you will, and then they executed it in OCPs while they practiced and learned, and then they executed it under load, and then lastly they executed it under load after a pre-fatigue. And the ultimate pre-fatigue we used was a 1,600 meter loaded ruck run. And so after soldiers did those physical activities characteristic of or representative of the baseline high physical demand tasks for soldiers, then we measured the physical exercises that correlated highest to performance on those vignettes.
So for people in my audience who aren't familiar with the new ACFT, and I'll definitely be making a link to it because I know Army has a really nice website about it, but what are the events that you settled on?
The events are conducted in order. There was a lot of discussion about rest intervals and those types of things. What we wanted to do is get the most physiologically sound data that we could get without taking long periods of time to administer the test. So they start with a 3 repetition maximum deadlift. Second event is the standing power throw, which interestingly has gained some traction. I don't know if you're tracking, but it's a part of the battlefield airman test now, and has got quite a bit of attention lately. The third is a little bit of a variation on the push-up we used to do. We're calling it the hand release push-up, and following that is the 250 meter sprint drag carry, where you sprint, you pull, you carry, and then the leg tuck is number 5, which is basically a climbing drill type of exercise with some degree of arm flexion, and then rotating the lower body up until your knees can touch your elbows, and then lastly a 2-mile run. So those are the 6 events in the order that they're conducted. Okay.
So one question I do have on the push-ups, because I mean, I actually am a fan of hand release push-ups. I've been doing those more since I left the military, but I know the Air Force, I had to do this kind of really subjective measure where it was your elbow had to break 90 degrees, but then that didn't work out for everybody's different body mechanics. So the question is, why the switch to hand release push-ups?
There's 2 primary reasons. Number 1, the hand release, and in particular the arm extension variation, is a much more objective measure to grade. If I had you start out on the ground and push through the full range of motion, it's virtually impossible not to be able to grade that properly. And as you said before, where I start, what my flexibility is, what's 90 degrees for me, the size of my triceps, that all made it relatively subjective on the old push-up. The second is we want to increase the intensity of the measure and therefore reduce the number of repetitions. Let's just say that from the ground to full extension is 100%. If I only go to 90 degrees, mathematically you might say, well, I'm only going through 50% of the range of motion. So by going all the way to the ground, I increase the intensity, and therefore I do significantly fewer repetitions, which in my mind is a good thing, right? Because I have to be stronger to do either the same number of repetitions or I do fewer repetitions. And having people do junk miles or junk repetitions really doesn't help us in terms of assessing physical fitness. So what we're seeing is somewhere between a 40 to 50% reduction in total number of push-ups, which I construe to be a good thing.
Right. So it's just, as weightlifters and bodybuilders would say, it's better intensity, better quality over number.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like people who exercise and do standing curls, and you see them, flex at the waist and bend at the knees to try to generate momentum to curl the weight, as opposed to having good posture and using their upper body to actually curl the weight. So if you stop and think about work capacity, in other words, how much work do? I do at least the same amount of work, if not more work, with the hand release push-up than I did with the old push-ups.
Now, I know the ACFT is not the first in the recent attempts to kind of redo a fitness test. I believe there was one kind of the mid-2000s that was also proposed. And I know ultimately TRADOC kind of said not to do it in 2011. Can you speak to what that test was about and why it never got adopted?
So it's a complicated story. It involves timing and the ability to conduct a scientific inquiry in a timely manner. And what happened was the group that was working on that more or less ran out of time. We generated a solution before we had an opportunity to collect a significant amount of empirical data. There were also restraints on it, artificial restraints relative to equipment and time, that current Army senior leaders removed when we started the baseline study. In that late 2000 time period, we were more or less under the same constraints as they were when they developed the 3-event APFT. No equipment, bare patch of ground, all of those things. So as individuals began to review this as it came out, the basic scientific underpinning was problematic. And then lastly, most individuals didn't believe that there was a significant increase in quality or predictability for the 2011 test. And it was put on hold, and almost immediately in 2012, they started to formulate the execution order to conduct a baseline soldier physical readiness requirement study.
And just out of curiosity for my own kind of knowledge here, because I know the Marine Corps also had put together their combat-oriented test too. Do you think there was any influence there, and that kind of said, all right, maybe we can consider equipment?
Absolutely. I think, and you bring up an interesting question that has much greater implications. I think eventually almost everyone would say you really need a physical fitness test. And if you remember correctly, we originally started calling this the Army Combat Readiness Test. And several of us lobbied to call it the Army Combat Fitness Test because it is a physical fitness test. I think most individuals would also argue that there needs to be some type of combat readiness test, like the Marine CFT combat test or the FORSCOM SRT, the soldier readiness test. I don't think anyone would deny that that's not an important part of this. And hopefully someday we'll see that resurface. But definitely having the Marines develop the CFT that involved equipment and involved setup time, I think was an important component of this.
And also just one other question one of my readers asked, as I mentioned I was coming into this, was I know you have the new leg tuck has kind of somewhat replaced the sit-up. So why the push away from sit-ups, which have been around, I think, for like 100 years in the different tests?
So if we look at the spectrum between high repetition, low load endurance, if you go off of NSCA standards and you're looking at 12 to 15 or greater repetitions at, less than, 50 to 65% of one rep max, those types of exercise develop a certain muscular architecture. And what we found in the baseline study is it's not very predictive of a soldier's ability to execute high demand tasks. When we started looking in the postmortem of the baseline study, scientific predictability was a significant part of it, but also injury prevention was a significant part of it. What we know is we suffer a tremendous number of musculoskeletal injuries to the core, lower back, lower body that are costly in terms of soldier productivity, but also just dollars. And so what we wanted was the same way with the push-up, was we wanted a higher intensity assessment that would serve to a certain degree as a forcing function to increase core strength that would help prevent these overuse load carriage injuries that we're seeing in soldiers who are carrying these heavy loads.
So actually, I know we're going to run out of time here in a minute, so I just want to give my last little bits of questions here. Since most of my audience is not, in fact, active duty military, but they're interested in physical fitness and skills, do you have suggestions for what kind of exercises the average person should be pursuing to be successful at something like this test if they want to do it on their own?
I'm a form follows function person, and so I believe that individuals need to focus on the core components of fitness, which for me are, strength, endurance, power, anaerobic endurance, and aerobic endurance. And they then need to translate that out to body parts. So I need to work on lower body strength and power generation. I need to work on upper body strength and power. I need to work on core strength. I need to work on anaerobic endurance, which we know as a training methodology is incredibly effective in ultimately training aerobic endurance, and then work on your aerobic endurance. To a certain degree, it kind of depends on how old you are, if you will. So as you ripen into my age category, you have a tendency to focus more on things that support activities of daily living and keep you healthy and fit and keep, body composition under control. I think a kind of a generalized program that has some resistance training, which helps us across the board, not the least of which to, prevent stress reaction injuries and osteoporosis, but also continue on then into the aerobic and anaerobic types of exercises. And I'm very simplistic. I like to do some type of resistance training 2 to 3 days a week and do some type of aerobic training 2 to 3 days a week. And to me, it's a fairly simple formula. I do believe that we underestimate the benefits of recovery. There's a wonderful article by a Dr. Andrews who does a case study of Paula Radcliffe, the world women's record holder for the marathon. And basically what she determined was later on in her career, in the year or two before she broke set the world's women marathon record, was if I can't go out and train 100% or work 100%, that probably needs to be my recovery day. And I need to understand my body and when I need to recover, which is another really difficult problem for the Army because, military services are industrial sized organizations, and it's hard to allow individuals to recover on the needs, on the basis of the individual. So, but I think recovery is also incredibly important, and obviously not the least of which is nutrition and sleep. So if you can pay attention to those big four, exercise, sleep, nutrition, and recovery, I think you're going a long way to a healthy lifestyle.
Okay. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask, but do you have any kind of favorite exercises that you like to prescribe for aerobic, anaerobic?
So, again, I used to be a long time ago. I was always a blue collar runner anyway, but I used to run a lot. I had a buddy in Tennessee, and we were, 50, 60 mile a week folks. I believe that wasn't all that deleterious, but if I were smarter then, or I would perhaps think of the aerobic components as being impact and non-impact. And I think it's important for individuals to learn that they can stress their cardiorespiratory system just as well on a bike or a stepper or a rower or in a swimming pool as they can out beating their feet on the road. So I would encourage people to seek out non-impact ways to do aerobic training. I'm a big fan of high intensity interval work. I'm a fan of doing, 200, 400 meter repeats with a rest or a walk in between. I think that's incredibly valuable. And then lastly, I think it's really important, especially as we get a little bit older, and considering the loads that soldiers carry, that we strengthen our lower body and core. Squats, front squats, back squats, deadlifts, all those types of exercises. So it's pretty generalized, but that's kind of where I focus.
And then here's my last question that I asked to all guests on the show. But if you could tell people to stop doing something immediately, what would that be?
So I am not a fan of junk miles and junk repetitions. So I'm not saying that it's inappropriate to go out and do a recovery run that's 10 miles at a 9 or 10 minute mile pace, or to do high numbers of repetitions of a particular exercise. But for me, professionally and personally, I don't see the benefit of that. I in particular, when I taught cadets at West Point, it was very common for a cadet to come in and I would say, "What workout are you doing today?" "Well, I'm going to go run." "Well, what's your plan?" "I'm going to go run." "Well, no. What's your training plan?" "Well, I'm going to go run." So I'm like, or I'm going to run to League 8. So the bottom line is, I think it's important to have a plan. I think it's important for your exercise to be progressive and sequential and regular. And when you do that, either with your battle buddy or with an exercise log, I think that helps you stay focused on your exercise program. So I'm not a fan of junk stuff. So,
but another way, it's have some accountability and then have a plan that you follow and follow through with. Don't do random stuff because you'll get random results.
Absolutely. I think it's we all know what the outcomes are for individuals who start random programs generally by themselves, and the prognosis is not good. They last a week or 2 or 5 or 8, but ultimately it burns out. So the idea of having some systematic sequential plan, be a part of a group, have a battle buddy, keep a log, I think that goes a long way to helping you understand intensity and recovery and keep you healthy while you're exercising.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Well, Dr. East, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you talking to me today.
Yeah, man. Thanks a lot. Good luck.
All right, guys, let's talk some key takeaways from this episode. This was a really good interview with a lot of information, and I think there's just a lot to try and organize in my head when it comes to physical fitness in general and the new Army fitness testing and everything that went into it, right? So let's go ahead and start at the beginning. How do we get to here? So my first major takeaway from this is that fitness in the military is not a new problem that we're just discovering now. It seems like there's been this struggle for hundreds of years of how do you effectively train a large industrial-sized military force while keeping the costs low and keeping it objective as opposed to subjective, right? So we're talking the late 1800s. It was very much a gymnastics thing where the emphasis was on well-being and feeling good because, you know what, we didn't have the medical treatments that we have now. Then getting into World War I, where we saw about half the population wasn't fit to fight, it wasn't because they were necessarily out of shape, but they actually had severe medical problems that were the results of diseases that we now have vaccines for, or losing arms and limbs and severe injuries that otherwise just made them unable to serve. In contrast, that problem has now shifted today, where only 2.8, 2.7 people out of the population out of 10 are able to serve in the military because they're not fit enough.
Depending on the numbers that you see today, that number is starting to creep down into the high twos. So 2.7, 2.8, 2.6 are medically and physically qualified to serve. And based on the number of service members that we recruit and train every year, that's incredibly problematic.
Now, my hope would be that this is not like a insurmountable problem, right? Because if we're not talking people losing hands and feet in the industry anymore before they get drafted, we're talking people who are just out of shape. And to be honest, out of shape is a problem that anybody can get over for the most part with good discipline and the right mindset. So it's something we can deal with. But one of the bigger questions is why the big decline from World War II to today? Because it's not just that we live less demanding lives, right? And one of the answers may actually be in sports. Now, one of the things I thought was really interesting was that the doctor pointed out that one of the big contributing factors to people being in better shape 50 years ago was that more people played sports recreationally. And I can say that when I was a kid, I played soccer just like everybody else did. Everybody played something, even if it was going outside and playing frisbee or tag or just having a water gun fight, right? And I feel like I see that less and less today. And I sometimes wonder why, and granted, video games are a big part of that, but the doctor pointed out that in a lot of ways, it's because we have almost professionalized youth sports that it discourages people from wanting to participate because they feel like if they're never going to get that scholarship, if they're not going to go pro, well, then their efforts are better spent somewhere else. And that's actually a very negative trend in how to train the youth and young people and high schoolers even on just being generally more active and physically fit. So let's play that clip.
And sport has become rather elitist, and part of that pertains to this perception that we need to start tracking young people into sports at earlier and earlier ages so that they might someday be the master of that sport, in their teens and early 20s.
Now, on the topic of how things have changed over the years, one of the interesting discussion points was the nature of the physical fitness, right? So the doctor pointed out that going into the late 1800s or 1900s, we had generally combat looked the same. People had to be able to run and sprint and carry their body weight and move well, but also just be healthy. But as we got into the age of conveniences where we had washing machines and irons and things that made stuff just easier for us, people got a little more lazy, but also the medical technology changed where we had vaccines. So it wasn't about wellness anymore, but the World War II showed us that you have to be able to move quick. And it was the invention of mechanized warfare that dramatically shifted things where you had to be able to keep up with vehicles and you had more armor and more equipment. And we kept putting more and more load onto the individual soldier, and more weight equals less mobility. And mobility is life. If you can't dive to cover and then sprint and move, you're not going to be effective anymore. And then as we got into the atomic age, into the Cold War, we saw another shift because significant thinking in the military was that we were never going to fight a ground war again. There was no more need to teach somebody to how to do an obstacle course quickly or dive here or drag a buddy because that just wasn't going to be the kind of fighting we were going to do anymore. Well, history shows us that was not true. And it turns out we still need to do all those things, which is why we ended up having to do a brand new PT test that Dr. East is responsible for helping create. So let's play another clip talking about how that transition happened.
Those training manuals talked about conducting exercise to develop physical vigor, health and vigor. So health and vigor were incredibly important at that time. And so doing things like aerobic types of exercises or body weight types of exercises were appropriate based on what the outcome objectives were. As we started to move into World War II, we started putting more and more on soldiers to the point where today most modern soldiers, as they go into a fight, are carrying somewhere between 80 to 90 pounds.
Now, another takeaway I got from this was the involvement of Dr. Kenneth Cooper in the revisions of all the PT testing. So coming from the Air Force myself, I know Ken Cooper came from the Air Force as a captain, as a scientist, and he is almost single-handedly responsible for what is modern aerobics. And funny story on that is that when I was at one of our professional education schools called Squadron Officer School in the Air Force, we actually had to keep track of our workouts, but do it in terms of cardio points. And I'm air quoting that, where we actually had a grid that I assume goes back to the Kenneth Cooper grid back in the 70s, where some kind of exercise done for some amount of time at some level of perceived effort, we earned exercise points. And we were required to log all of our exercise and get to certain numbers of exercise points every week. And people like me kind of looked at that and went, well, where's the weightlifting on this? Because that was always my preferred way to work out, and there wasn't anything. So we had to improvise or just go do things we didn't usually do, like lots more running, a lot more cycling and stuff that just was different. And it's kind of counter to modern fitness culture with like CrossFit and such. So the takeaway from that is that because it was easy to measure and it was scientifically influential, the aerobic style PT testing, which was really going to be 3 events of push-ups, sit-ups, and a run, became dominant. I mean, it was easy to do. You could do it without equipment, and you could do it on any patch of grass anywhere in the world with any NCO or officer looking over somebody's shoulder. So it was just very convenient. But convenient doesn't mean it was necessarily predictive of good performance in the field. Now, one of my favorite things that came out of this, it's kind of besides the point, but I wanted to make a reference to it because it kind of validated a lot of my feelings on the matter, as well as a lot of people I know on active duty or have been on active duty. And that is the current 3-event physical fitness test, as I'm air quoting on that again, is it's not really about physical fitness. It's an overall wellness test that's used as an HR management tool for figuring out who is going to be getting what opportunities, who gets to have what kind of career. And that really isn't the point of a physical fitness test.
Most individuals focus primarily on the 3-event test for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is it became institutionalized as sort of a human resource tool in terms of promotion and professional military education schools and those types of things.
So the next thing I want to take away from this is talking about why we're getting away from the 3-event PT test. Now, the Army actually tried this a few times, and Dr. East pointed out that in the early 2000s to like 2010 timeframe, we actually did develop another one. And people have asked me, in running up to this interview, why those didn't stick around, why did we abandon them? Because they actually got a lot of press, and I'll have some links in the show notes about that. And the big takeaway on that one was that we actually ran out of time. And the requirements at the time still had to be any patch of grass, anywhere in the world, kind of the minimal equipment requirement. But the way that we eventually shifted away was we used to require equipment. So let's actually be realistic about this. So the new ACFT does go back to using equipment and narrowed it down to 5 main movements that were the biggest reasons or the biggest like kind of grouping of things that soldiers would have to do in a combat environment, from dragging a buddy to carrying things under load, lower body power, upper body power, core strength. It's kind of the main stuff. And here, let's just play that quote.
Move under load to contact, build a hasty fighting position, move over, under, around and through obstacles on unimproved terrain, react to direct contact, and extract and evacuate a casualty.
So now we get to a test where we are much more directly measuring the things that affect somebody's job performance. And I wouldn't be surprised to see this be more across the board in all the services. I know the Marine Corps already has a kind of test like this, but this is the new PT test for record. Now, on that note, something else that came up in the interview and the reading I did before this was the reason that the 3-event test kind of stuck around was because it was convenient to measure. I already said once before, it was convenient because it was easy to do, but from a performance measurement standpoint, when I say performance, I don't mean physical, I mean your career performance. It was a very easy way to separate people because it was objective. If I had 2 people in front of me and person 1 had a very high fitness test and they did good at their job, and person 2 was also good at their job but had a lower fitness test, it was much easier for commanders to look at those 2 and clearly say, well, that guy who has a higher PT test, he clearly cares more and does better at his job, right? Now, in reality, maybe person 2 actually was slightly better, but as long as they were doing good enough and there wasn't a distinct difference in their job performance, PT was an easy way to separate the really high performers from the mediocre performers. And that's true in every service. Now, something else I thought was interesting when it came to the new events, which you heard the doctor talk about, things like the deadlift and the standing power throw. But what I thought was interesting was the change to the push-up, right? Now, every service had a different way of measuring push-ups. So when I was in the Air Force, in our fitness testing, I had to start in the up position with a flat back, and I lowered myself until my elbows broke 90 degrees. Now, when you have really long arms, that range of motion is significantly different than somebody with short arms, and actually got very subjective when the graders were looking at you, because for me, 90 degrees, I'm almost laying on the ground. But I had buddies with short arms and massive triceps who could just vibrate up and down practically, and they would just knock out 60, 70 push-ups in a minute, and like they wouldn't break a sweat. And they didn't even move more than a couple inches because they had such scrawny T-Rex arms, right? And me with my big monkey arms, I had a long way to go up and down, so I didn't do as many push-ups. Now, in the Army, with the new tests, they're switching to something called the hand release push-up, which I've been doing thanks to the programs I've gotten from the Mountain Tactical Institute with Rob Shaw, where you go all the way to the ground and you pick your hands up off the floor and then you put them back down and push yourself up again. So it's 100% all the way up, all the way down. I think in the Army's version, you have to move your hands out to the side. I'm going to put a link to the microsite in the show notes so you can actually see how these movements are performed. But as the doctor pointed out, this new style of push-up actually increases the intensity, and they are fully expecting to get fewer repetitions, but they are more quality repetitions. And that's the important. We don't want junk reps. We don't want junk miles. We want good quality, high intensity movement that we can objectively measure. And it's hard to be subjective about, did he go all the way to the ground, take your hands off the floor, and then do the next rep? That's a much more objective way to measure a push-up than trying to kind of guess if their elbows went to the right degree. Now, another part of this conversation that I wanted to highlight was when I asked about coming up, or not even coming up with your own, but when you want to do your own training program, whether it's you're doing it on yourself or you're relying on somebody else to provide it to you, what should that program look like if you're trying to prepare for the kind of events that this new fitness test has? And Dr. East pointed out kind of the 5 major areas of fitness as far as he's concerned. There's strength, power, endurance, aerobic capacity, and anaerobic capacity. And all of those are kind of different realms, and they're all important. And your training program should attack each of those. And to be honest, most of us don't do that. Most of us will pick 1 or 2 things that we're good at, and we do that a lot. You know, you get runners who do just a lot of aerobic conditioning. You get weightlifters who do just a ton of weightlifting if we do that strength and power. But really a good balanced program, a good tactical fitness program, and I'll put a link to my tactical fitness article in the notes about this, it covers all of those things. And that's how you get a well-rounded profile that makes you successful, not only on a fitness test like this, but also just in life in general. Now, one of the last things I want to get into here is the actual programming of your fitness system. Now, I am not a fitness expert. I'm not going to claim that credit, so don't take this as my medical advice. You should always get an expert. But here's the basic takeaway I want to get from this, is that there's 3 big items here. Number 1, you need to listen to your body when it comes to recovery. You know, a lot of the research these days is showing that recovery is just as important as the stress you put on yourself, right? If you do nothing but always stress the body to the point where you're like, I'm going to get stronger, I'm going to get faster, but you keep putting stress on it, it's never actually going to improve because your body needs that time to build those improvements. You need to give yourself recovery time. So like the doctor said, if you don't feel like you can go 100% in your workout, then that means you should probably be resting. Now, that said, when it comes to actually programming your workouts, there's 2 things here. Don't do junk repetitions and junk miles. Don't just do something haphazardly because you think you should be there. And I'm guilty of this myself lately, as he was talking about doing dumbbell curls or bicep curls and kind of throwing your body weight to get momentum on there. I've been doing that lately. I know I shouldn't. I should be doing strict form because that's how you target the right muscles. So don't do junk miles for the sake of doing it. Actually focus, build that mind-muscle connection, and actually focus on the muscles or activities you're trying to do and do them correctly. And on that note, still, you need to have a plan. The example the doctor gave was when he talked to a student at West Point and he said, hey, what's your workout going to be today? And the guy said, oh, I'm going for a run. So let's play that clip.
when I taught cadets at West Point, it was very common for a cadet to come in and I would say, what workout are you doing today? Well, I'm going to go run. Well, what's your plan? I'm going to go run. Well, no. What's your training plan? Well, I'm going to go run. So I'm like, or I'm going to run to League 8. So the bottom line is I think it's important to have a plan.
So a while ago, when I wrote an article on tactical fitness, I talked to Rob Shaw at the Mountain Tactical Institute, who I mentioned earlier here. I'll throw a link in the show notes. And I asked him, what is something that he wishes people would stop doing? And his answer was that people need to have an actual plan put together by somebody who knows what they're doing and what it means to program fitness. If you do random exercises out of a hat and you don't track progress over time and stick to it, you're going to get random or even poor results because you're not actually doing your body any favors, right? So it's worth taking the time to talk to an expert and have them put together an effective training plan that helps you get stronger and faster and more capable without injuring yourself. And I also know that one very well too, because I have injured myself pretty badly by not taking rest when I know I should have. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up today's episode. First off, I want to say thanks for listening. This was a really good interview. I really enjoyed taking the time to research this and get into it. If you liked it, let me know. I did a lot more homework on this one, so I feel like I went into it knowing more information. I want to know how that came across to you guys. So don't forget to come by the website. You can comment on this actual post. Look at the detailed show notes at everydaymarksman.co/6. Number 6. That's everydaymarksman.co/6. Come on by, let me know. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to the website. Of course, I do appreciate if you subscribe on your podcast player of choice. Leave me a review, 4 or 5 stars, 1 star. If you hate me, that's cool. I appreciate the feedback, but I definitely would like you guys to come by the website, participate with the community, and yeah. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and I will catch you guys next time.